Hello, everyone. Welcome to Curious K Podcast. My name is Kolapo, and I'm your host. I want to say thank you to everyone that is listening to the show across the world. And this is the 28th episode of the show, and I'm very excited. And if you're joining us for the first time, Curious K Podcast is a show where I meet with amazing startup founders and ecosystem enablers working to make entrepreneurship thrive in Africa. And today, we are happy to have Abake Adenle on the show. She's the founder of AJALA Studios, a company that builds enterprise speech technologies for low-resource languages with a focus on African languages. And this is just very interesting for me because I remember in like 2012 or so, I was on a quest to build a speech synthesis, for English language with African accent. And that actually led me to build Talking Books, which is an audiobook company. And we had to pivot because, of course, most of the voices available then were very robotic, and it was hard to find a team that can build such products. So when I read about Abake, I was just very excited to learn about what she's building, what she's built so far, and it's just very exciting to have you on the show, Abake. So thank you for joining us on Curious K Podcast.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you for having me on the show.
All right. So how are you doing today? How is it going?
Yeah, I'm pretty good, thank you. And how are you?
Yeah, good. It's a cloudy day in Lagos, but we're enjoying the weather.
Nice, very nice.
All right. Yeah. So can you give us a peek into your background?
Yeah, sure. I guess my background is a little complicated, but maybe that's not unusual for many Nigerians. I was actually not born in Nigeria. I was born in America, but I lived in Nigeria until I was about 6, and then my parents moved the family back to the States. But when I was 11, my parents sent me to boarding school in Nigeria for about a little bit over 4 years. Then I moved back to the States, and then I'm ultimately moved to England, where I finished my academic career, I guess you could say, and I started working in finance. I worked in finance for about 8 years before founding Ajala. And all of that kind of sounds very tidy, but yeah, it's not necessarily the most straightforward path.
All right. Yeah. So can you remember, the boarding school experience? Because I know Nigerian parents will always want you to feel the Nigerian culture, really.
Yeah. The boarding school experience, I think, so, and I won't like name the first school that I went to for a term just so I don't like shame schools or anything, but my parents sent us to a school in Lagos in the first term, and I think it was a little bit too much culture shock. So we only stayed there for one term. But then we moved to a school. At the time, it was in Ikeja. It's actually owned by my aunt,
Okay.
Nike Adamaleku. We moved to Supreme Education Foundation. I was there for about 2 terms, and that was like in Ikeja. It was much more like yeah, it was much more comfortable and all of that. But then my parents actually founded a school in Ibadan, and I was there for about a little bit over 3 years before I
Nice,
moved back to the States.
nice, nice. And interesting story. You have there. You were able to, to get to a level of education where you actually have PhD in engineering, right?
Yeah.
And so what made you wanted to attain such level of education? What was it?
Yeah, I think so. My on both sides of my family, my mother and my father's side, there are a lot of academics, and my father also had a PhD. So I think when I was a child, you want to be like your parent, and in my mind, like having a PhD kind of always sounded cool. But then I finished my undergrad, or I was approaching finishing my undergraduate degree, and I actually didn't feel like I knew enough. And it felt like the natural next step would be to pursue a PhD. And I was lucky enough to get admission into a PhD program from after completing my undergraduate degree. And so that's kind of the journey. I don't necessarily think that I wanted to be an academic. I never had any interest in teaching or being a professor. But I've always enjoyed learning and kind of absorbing information and thinking about things.
Yeah, and I think the influence too. I mean, you can't take that out of the picture,
Mm.
based on your background, really. Yeah. So at a point, you built a language learning application in Yoruba, right?
Yeah, speak Yoruba.
Yeah. So what influence? I think I read briefly that maybe one of your niece or nephew. Can you just share that story with us?
Yeah, yeah. So this was while I was still working at Morgan Stanley, and I just randomly decided to build a mobile app, which I saw my niece and nephew. I think at the time they were probably like maybe 3 or 4 years old, and they were playing with an English language learning app. Because I would download a lot of apps on my phone, and I would let them play with my phone, and they would always go back to this app that would like flashcards, one flashcard for each letter in the language, presumably to help a child kind of like build their vocabulary. And I thought, this would be cool to have for other languages. And so I contacted an illustrator, Andrew Kolb, whose style I really liked, and he came up with the style of the characters in the app, which actually ended up gaining a lot of interest online. But I did all of the coding, and the app ended up doing, pretty well for what it was, because I didn't really promote it, but it got a lot of attention on Twitter, and it was a paid app. Actually made a little trailer for the app. I also worked in studio. I wrote a treatment, and I licensed some music from a high life musician called Abake Adenle. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. And he basically made a recording of a traditional Nigerian folk song called Laba Laba. And
That's butterfly, right?
yeah, exactly, Butterfly. I thought that it would make a nice soundtrack to the trailer. So I wrote this treatment kind of inspired by the song and inspired by the flashcards and all of that. And the trailer ended up doing quite well online as well. I think maybe it got like 30,000 views or something like that. At the time, it was substantial. And yeah, the app did well, but I was working as a banker, and it wasn't like something that I viewed as like, a career move or something substantial. So I kind of put it to the side. But I often got requests to build apps in other languages. And yeah, it was just something that was kind of like in the back of my mind, but I didn't necessarily engage with it in a substantial way after publishing the app.
Nice, but I think that's where the whole entrepreneurial pursuit started. And I would just like to understand, all right, you have a PhD in engineering,
Hmm.
and you mentioned you work with Morgan Stanley, which is kind of like finance. So
Hmm.
how was that like? I mean, engineering background, working in finance role. Can you just demystify that?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it was actually quite to use your term, mystified. It was quite mystical when I started, because I went straight from undergrad to PhD, and I'd never really had like a proper internship. So before I started, so I didn't even know. I just had, I guess, technical knowledge that they thought would be useful, but I didn't really know until I started the work. But basically, my role was as an equity derivative strategist. And that means that I was coming up with trading strategies for institutional investors. And an institutional investor is basically an institution that holds a large amount of capital. It could be a hedge fund, it could be like a corporate, like the treasury of a large company, could be a pension fund, insurance company, sovereign wealth fund, but all of these institutions that hold large amounts of capital often have to invest that capital to achieve specific aims. And my role was to come up with ways that they could achieve these aims using derivatives.
That sounds really interesting and complex.
It was very interesting. I think it was actually a really great way to gain introduction to finance because I was basically like what you would call a quant, but there are lots of different types of quants.
Mm,
And I think what was interesting, and this was all quite serendipitous because it wasn't like planned on my part, but this role allowed me to be the type of quant where I wasn't necessarily stuck in a corner just writing models, developing models. I would come up with models, but they had to have a practical utility. They had
mm,
to be able to deliver value to the bank in some way. And even beyond that, I would often go on meetings, go on meetings with sales from the bank to actually deliver these strategies or pitch these strategies to these institutions. And so I had to develop communication skills that I definitely didn't need to use or cultivate in my grad program, but learning how to explain things that are complex to people who aren't necessarily complex, but in a way that conveys the information succinctly and clearly. So I think it was a great way to enter to finance.
absolutely. Yeah. So, at what point did you switch to entrepreneurship full time? Okay, this is a time for me to do my own thing or focus on this application or whatever you were doing at that point. At what point did you realize and what made you make that decision?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say that it wasn't like a sharp switch. I kind of phased in, phased out. So
Okay.
I'd spent about 8 years at Morgan Stanley, and I was definitely itching for a change, but I didn't know what I wanted to do. And I had a few opportunities within finance, but I kind of wanted to do something different. And while I'd been pursuing my PhD, through my advisor, my supervisor, my PhD supervisor, I got the opportunity to consult for a startup. And I maintained a relationship with the CEO of the startup. And at the time, I was chatting with him. I wanted to start a company, but I had some ideas and I didn't know what. And I also knew that I didn't necessarily want to go the VC route. I didn't want to raise large amounts of capital. I wanted to build, I mean, maybe some VCs would call it a lifestyle business. I don't think it's a lifestyle business. I wanted to be in control of the growth trajectory of the business to as great a degree as I possibly could. I didn't want to kind of start a business where my aim would be like growth, 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 growth. I wanted to start a business where I could build something meaningful. And we were having this discussion, and he mentioned to me Innovate UK. And he was like, these grants, they're super competitive, but you have a good background. I think you should apply. And at this point, I was like, okay, why not? I put together an application, I think in like June of 2016. And a couple months later, I found out that I got the grant, which was quite
Wow.
surprising. The grant funded me for a little bit over a year to the opportunity to explore voice recognition and speech synthesis for two African languages. And I basically spent those 13 months building out prototype voice recognition and speech synthesis models for Yoruba and Swahili. But I also, I think like halfway through, I started doing consulting work as well in finance. So I kind of had a parallel business, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
And it's actually still something that I continue to do because I enjoy finance and I like to have my hands in like a number of different pots. And we reached the end of the grant period,
Right.
and I wanted to know, what to do next. But even I should actually go back. So once I was awarded the grant, I was like, okay, so to whatever degree this idea isn't crazy, so let's see if this can be something more.
Yeah, so let's go into your work at AJALA Studios.
Okay.
So I remember you mentioned speech recognition, voice synthesis. So can you just tell us about that?
Yeah, so at Ajala, we make what we call tools that help enterprises build voice automation experiences in African languages. And our initial core focus is on voice recognition and speech synthesis. In terms of voice recognition, I always like to make the analogy with like Siri or Alexa. So, like when you talk to your device, voice recognition is the bit of the process that allows Siri to kind of understand what you're saying, that converts your spoken speech into digital text. So we've built models that can achieve that, but for various African languages. And speech synthesis is the model that allows Siri to say something back to you. So it's a model that can generate human speech from digital text. We have kind of other areas that we're looking at as well, in the sort of natural language processing space and the speech technology space, but our two core focuses are voice recognition and speech synthesis.
All right. Yeah. Thanks for talking about that. So, how was it like building your team, and raising funds? And if you can just tell us about maybe the applications of the speech recognition that you're building.
Yeah, I mean, building the team was very challenging. I'd say it's still very challenging. Um, I was lucky enough to get a second round of funding that was much larger from Innovate UK, and I guess you could say that was like our seed or pre-seed round, and that allowed me to hire about 3 people full time to join the team. But the process was challenging, because you have to, when you have a small company, you're trying to build a culture, you're trying to find people who resonate with what you're building, and you're also trying to make sure that they're fulfilled in their career. Sometimes you're lucky and you hire someone who's like great, and sometimes it takes just a little bit more effort to kind of um, to get to that point where you're achieving something that's mutually beneficial. I would say ultimately people that I've hired have come from actually the one person was just serendipity. She approached the company and initially to participate in a small project, and ultimately she's grown into a much bigger role. And another person was through a personal recommendation from someone I know. So I would say there's no formula, but I can say that for me, it's definitely been challenging. And from what I hear from other friends who are running startups, like hiring it can be tricky.
Yeah, yeah. And in 2016, you were nominated for Innovation Prize for Africa. So
Yeah.
can you tell us about that?
Yeah, yeah. So this was, I think I mentioned earlier that I didn't want to pursue VC funding. And so I was looking at lots of different grants, and one of the grant opportunities that seemed interesting was the Innovation Prize for Africa. And I applied for that, and I ended up being selected as a finalist, which was great. It was an interesting experience. We were all flown to Ghana, and there was a week of events, although I was only able to participate in a few days. But it gave us the opportunity. We met the president of Ghana, and we got to network, I guess you could say. But it was a very interesting experience, and I think it also speaks to the importance that grant funding or non-equity funding plays in the tech space in Africa. Now that payment startups have just kind of taken off, VC has become much more accessible to African startups. But there was a point where maybe 3, 4 years ago where grant funding was still kind of, the starting point for a lot of startups. And I think that grants still play a significant role, especially for startups that are maybe not necessarily in spaces where VCs necessarily understand within the African ecosystem.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I mean, you're right. And what I can just pick from what you've said so far is, I mean, you were very clear from day one. You wanted to build something and you wanted to take your time, right?
Yeah,
Because pressure, a lot of pressure comes with VC money, right?
exactly. Yeah, and the reality is like with speech technologies, there's product market fit in Europe, in the US, and China, but product market fit hasn't been established in Africa. I think we're probably one of the only, if not the only, startup that is focused specifically on building speech technologies for the African market. And I've spoken with entrepreneurs in the UK who have made attempts maybe 10, 15 years ago in the very, very early days of speech technologies, even in the West. And I mean, their situation was probably a little bit unique because perhaps they didn't have local knowledge, but I think that I could tell that this was a proposition that would need potentially a long lead time, and VC funding is not the kind of funding that makes sense in that context. So, and also I didn't want to, I don't necessarily like the ethos that taking VC funding kind of imposes on a startup. I mean, obviously, it depends on the type of VC, but there's generally a type of approach to building your business that you kind of have to take, and that isn't necessarily what I wanted or want. So.
Yeah, cool. I think it's just important for startup founders to be clear. I mean, in terms of what they want to build and how they want to, you know, access smart money or smart investment,
Yeah.
without pressure,
Yeah.
to build something that is sustainable, And I think you've been able to to find that. And congratulations on recently winning Women in Voice DEI award. And so what was that process like? I mean, we'd like to learn from you.
Yeah, that was a complete surprise. I had no idea I would be nominated, and when I found out I was nominated, I was shocked enough. I just assumed, okay, that's nice. And then next thing I see that I've won, and I'm like, wow, okay. So
Yeah.
it was all very surprising. The women who run the organization, they're very excellent at what they do. Their aim is to promote the role of women in speech technologies. But what they do is not just for women. They're trying to create a big tent to attract as many people as possible to this cause of championing and raising the profile of women who are doing things in this space. And I'm very grateful to them for the accolade.
And did you think being a woman has given you more opportunities to access some of these grant opportunities in building your businesses so far?
Um, I would say, as with all things in life, there are trade-offs. So obviously, over the last maybe 2 or 3 years, there's been increasing interest in promoting the role of women in technology. But I think that behind that, we have centuries of bias against women in not just in technology, but in the workplace. So I think being a woman offers certain advantages, but at the same token, there are certain downsides as well, or
Mm.
there are certain challenges that you face. And I think it's just a question of each person trying to navigate the trade-offs between those opportunities and those challenges, as well as luck, to the best that you can.
All right. Yeah. I mean, you said centuries there's been bias. I mean, against women. Not just in technology, and that's right. And this will also take a long time. I mean, to overcome such bias. And but I think generally there is a lot of call for support for women, a lot of women startup founders, and there was a research as well that maybe less than a certain percentage get to women-led startups when it comes to VC investment, for example. And I hopefully believe that will change and that will keep improving with time. All right. So you are also an American Association, part of the American Association of the Advancement of Science, Leshner Fellow. So can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so I was a Leshner Fellow for the year 2020-2021, focusing on artificial intelligence. And in my role as a I my aim is to promote public discourse around the role and the potential impact of artificial intelligence in Africa. And one of the things that I did to kind of promote this discourse was organize a series of webinars on AI and African enterprises, just kind of examining the impact AI is having and could have on African enterprises from lots of different perspectives, bringing in lots of thought leaders and experts to contribute to this discussion and kind of rooting everything from an African perspective. So bringing in African experts, focusing on African topics, kind of enshrining everything in Africa, as it were. Yeah.
And how is what has been the experience? What do you think, or what can you say about AI adoption in Africa? I mean, what can you say has been some of the key things that you think you've picked up and you like to share in this podcast about some of those sessions that you've hosted?
Yeah, I think the most popular session that we hosted was on security and data privacy because it's getting a lot of attention in the media, but it's getting a lot of attention in the media from a Western perspective, but it also plays a significant role on businesses as well as consumers. And there was a lot of interest from people who were trying to get an understanding of the evolving regulatory landscape. Because countries like Nigeria, for example, with NITDA, recently released the NDPR, this, I guess, the Nigerian analog to GDPR, and countries like Kenya and Ghana as well, doing the same. And businesses are trying to understand the potential impact that could have on their interaction with their customers. And especially from a Nigerian perspective, I think there's often a lot of skepticism and reluctance when people are looking at their interactions with businesses or government, and there are questions from a consumer perspective around how data is being protected and preserved.
We still have a whole lot of work to do in Nigeria when it comes to data privacy. And I think startups can lead the way in making sure, and we can even lead the way and show the government the way to do the right things when it comes to having these kind of conversations. So let's go back to Ajala. So where do you see your company, I mean, in the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, in the next 5 to 10 years, I would hope that we would be active in at least 10 countries in Africa, offering a suite of products covering at least 30 African languages that are facilitating voice automation and helping African businesses interact with their customers in a meaningful way. So I think that the ultimate sort of end game, I guess if you could think of it that way, is that we want to be the customer that are the startup that defines how voice can deliver meaningful value to both businesses, African businesses, and African consumers. And I would like to have achieved that goal in the next 5 to 10 years.
Amazing. Looking forward to that. And at that point, I mean, it will still be great to have you on Curious K podcast when
I
all
hope
things
so.
has been done. All right. So, is there anything you'd like to share with us as we round up?
No, I just think that the work you're doing with the podcast is really great. You're opening up these conversations in like a very deliberate way, and you're giving entrepreneurs and participants in the African ecosystem an opportunity to kind of share their perspectives, which is great.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Abake, for being on the show.
All right. Thank you for having me.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for listening to this episode of Curious K podcast. And see you next time. Bye-bye.